Hello, and welcome to American Heron Wargaming. This is a battle report for Warhammer 40k 10th edition. This is actually a special battle report in two aspects, as it was my first 40k match using a 2,000 point army, but it was also the last match I played before Pariah Nexus dropped. So this match was using the Leviathan mission pack, and none of the data slate rules updates. We got started off by building up the mission. We drew the hammer and anvil deployment, so it would be engaging with a fairly narrow cross-section of the map. Our primary mission was supply drop, so in turns 4 and 5 an objective marker in no man's land would be removed. For the mission rule, we got Maelstrom of Battle, which drew and applied two different mission rules. Supply lines basically let everyone act like Gretchen and potentially farm a command point from their home objective. And then we got Minefields, so an advance roll of 6 would earn us a mortal wound. My army ended up being very character heavy, mainly because it was tricky to fill out the 2,000 point limit without also going over it. I had two squads of Hearthkin warriors split up into Sagittars. One of the groups being carried in the Sagittar was led by Uthar the Destined. That group had two warriors equipped with melee weapons and the Thane, who also had an additional melee weapon. I'd seen this build before as an unexpectedly lethal melee punch-up from a smaller unit, and was interested to try it. One of the other 5-kin split squads went into reserves as backup. Then I had a brick of 10 Hearthguard with Volkite disintegrators led by a Call stored up in Deep Strike. Another squad of 5 Hearthguard with Plasma Blasters were led by an Einherjar champion and were riding in one of the Hecaton land fortresses. The other Hecaton had a 3-pack of Brokir Thunderkin with Graviton Blast cannons for some real anti-tank and anti-horde power. Flying in from the flanks were two 3-bite groups of the Hernkin Pioneers. And then rounding out the list were an Einherjar champion and a Grimnir, each running on their own. My thought was that they could hang back and do actions for secondary missions while still being non-trivial to kill with their invulnerable saves. My opponent was fielding the Astra Militarum, and I don't have their exact army list, but using the photo and my memory I can work most of it out. They had one tank commander Leman Russ and then another standard Russ. A Hellhound bulked out the direct damage armored core. Then, for indirect power, they had two Basilisks, those are the unpainted ones without the turrets, and a Manticore. To support all that indirect fire were two Scout Sentinels for performing some daring recon. For troops on foot, there was a squad of 6 Bulgrins with shields and mauls, a squad of Ratlings, and some Tempestus Scions in Deep Strike. 2 units of Khazarkin, led by a Castellan and a Psyker, would roll up in Chimeras, alongside a complement of Rough Riders. We tried to build something similar to a Games Workshop tabletop layout, closing off all direct lines of fire from one starting area to the other, but still ended up with some pretty wide firing lanes. Then we got set up. Both sides were relatively balanced, but I put both Hecatons to line up on the bottom of the map, and my opponent had their Kaskarin and Rough Riders prepped to push for the north. For scout moves, I pushed up aggressively with my Bikes and Sagittars. One of the Scout Sentinels and the Center Chimera also moved up while still being careful to stay well behind cover. I also laid out my initial 4 Judgment tokens. Both Chimeras, one of the Scout Sentinels, and the Tank Commander had the Eye of the Ancestors fall upon them. I got turn 1 and drew behind enemy lines and secure no man's land as my secondary missions for the turn. There was no way to get behind enemy lines, but with an aggressive push I claimed the north and south objectives, which would earn me secure no man's land. The Hecatons also moved up, but a bit more trepidatiously. After securing my home objective, the small 5-Quin squad also advanced up to make a play for the center objective in turn 2. The solo Grimnir and Champ held back in my deployment zone, preparing to screen out deep strikes and being ready in case they were needed to investigate signals. In the shooting phase, the combined firepower of all the Sagittars' weapons and the Pioneers' volume fire, supported by a double Judgment token and the Ancestral Sentence stratagem, popped the Chimera and spelled out the Khazarkin within. My command point pinata was well secured. A surprising number of the Khazarkin also tripped on their way out of the Chimera, and 4 were lost to the Inferno. In the engagement phase, the Pioneers charged into the Khazarkin to try to clear them out. Their efforts were not successful, though. They knocked out one and took 2 wounds in return. On the other side of the board, the Sagittar on the south side of the board was actually just in range to send some missiles into the Manticore. I secured 5 victory points for secure no man's land, and ditched behind enemy lines for a command point. My opponent's first draws were a series of don't play this on turn 1, reshuffle and try again. In the end, they ended up with Assassination and Cleanse. In their movement phase, they advanced the Bulgrin and caught some mines for their trouble. The Hecaton tried for an Overwatch shot on Leman Russ, but only planked 2 damage off after a full send. The tanks converged on the firing line in the south, whereas the north was the focus of the Rough Riders, surviving Chimera, Hellhound, and one of the Scout Sentinels. Despite the original plan, the tank commander wheeled around and sent all of their weapons into the Sagittar. After popping Void Armor, it was able to survive that fusillade, but only with 3 wounds left. One of the Basilisks went next and finished it off, popping out Uthar and his entourage. The Chimera and Scout Sentinel whittled down the Pioneers to a single remaining Bike. After a round of firing from the Hellhound, Uthar stood alone with 4 wounds left. The surviving Khazarkin poured on the fire, and Uthar finally went down, earning my opponent full points for the assassination mission. On the other side of the board, the other Sagittar also weathered a full send from the Manticore, but was finished off by the Leman Russ, whose bolters also whittled down the squad which had disembarked from it. With one surviving Hearthkin on the objective point, a full Basilisk barrage brought the phase to a grisly end. The first round of guard shooting was over, and the front line of the kin had evaporated. The Khazar-kin and Sentinel charged into the remaining Pioneer, but were not able to secure the kill. So this is what I was looking at the start of turn 2. Though before my opponent's turn ended, I pulled my remaining full squad of Pioneers up into reserves. For my secondaries, I pulled Cleanse and Defend Stronghold. I could have taken the chance that my Pioneer would be battle-shocked and gotten to use this cool new token I'd printed out. But my opponent reminded me that if I got battle-shocked, I wouldn't have any objective control on the point, and thus would lose out on the victory points for the primary objective. So I spent the command point to auto-pass the test and gained 5 VP for that. Worth it. The kin were on the move after that. Heka 2 pushed up and dropped off the Thunderkin with 2 juicy tank targets ready and waiting. The Hearthguard popped out of Heka 1 and slogged up almost to the center objective point, but couldn't quite make it. Fortunately, the other Hearthkin squad was able to make it up there for some cleansing. I also brought in my other 5-man squad from reserve to cleanse the point in the south. The northern side of the board needed some shoring up, so I brought those Pioneers back in, and dropped my Khal-led 10-kin strong Hearthguard brig to fill in the gap. The remaining Pioneer from the other group fell back using a command point so that it could still fire this turn. I wanted all the firepower I could get. The Hecatons and Thunderkin put in a mighty effort and dropped both Leman Russes down to 3 wounds remaining. Unfortunately, I didn't close either of them out. That was due to expecting Heka 1 to be able to see the tank commander through the ruins, but it was not able to get far enough forward to do so. Oof. On the other side of the board, the Khazar-kin were wiped off the board, the Scout Sentinel and the Hellhound took a beating too. In the charge phase, I made an astoundingly lucky pair of charges, 9 inches into the Sentinel and 10 crossing the center objective into the Bullgrin. 3 of the Bullgrin dropped, the Sentinel was reduced to scrap, and I was able to consolidate onto the objective. At the end of my turn, the wall had been rebuilt, and some serious damage was done, but the question was if it was going to be enough. My opponent continued to get awful secondary draws, getting both capture enemy outpost and behind enemy lines. What would have been trivial in turn 3 was basically impossible. And since I still had Defend Stronghold active, that represented a huge potential point shift. Khazar-kin disembarked from the Chimera, joining with the Rough Riders to face down the massive Hearthguard. The Khazar-kin squadron, which was just wiped out, was immediately replaced by reinforcements popping up in the north, putting the Hearthguard at the center of a pincer attack. The tank commander pushed up as well, hoping to pick some individuals out of the smaller group of Hearthguard to give the Ogrins a fighting chance. The Imperial Battle Psyker went first, and failed to even hit the massive kin in front of him. Then, for good measure, he blew himself up with the hazardous check. The rest of the shooting in that quadrant was more productive, picking up 3 Pioneers and 2 Hearthguard, but there was still quite a lot of horse there. The tank commander tried, but with their natural resiliency and cover, the smaller group of Hearthguard only lost 1 member. The other tanks split fire into the Thunderkin and the Hearthkin in the ruins, unable to clear out much of either, having taken enough damage to be less effective when firing. In the end, it was up to the Basilisk to finish off the Hearthkin on the center point, but even that wasn't enough. 1 survivor stood alone. Then it was time for some charges. The Khazar-kin poured into the Hearthguard, supported by a cavalry charge from the Rough Riders as well. However, the first Khazar-kin melee attack did not go well, landing only a single wound. The rest of the melee pulled a few Hearthguard down, but the retribution was swift. The newly reinforced Khazar-kin unit was cut down to only 3 models remaining, and the one which had just disembarked from its Chimera was only left with 1. At the end of turn 2, my opponent conceded, with the 2 Leman Russes posed to be wiped out, along with all of the infantry. Taking and holding any objective seemed unlikely. I personally think that might have been a little premature, but it had also gotten a bit late. Overall, I was just pretty happy to have my first 2,000 point game go so well for me. It's been a pretty long journey getting this army fully built up and painted, so I'm really jazzed to see it on the table in all of its glory. Now that it's fully table ready, I'm looking forward to getting even more games of 40k played in the future, and we'll be bringing those battle reports here. That's it for now, and don't forget, the ancestors are watching.